Something happened about 17 years ago that completely altered my life. I became embroiled in a convoluted situation. I had an extramarital affair with a pastor's wife who was the leader of a large Pentecostal megachurch. The turn of events? We both had a dark secret that, if revealed, might make the front page of the newspaper. To avoid being discovered, I had to be extremely cautious and conceal a lot of information. I ended up going into yet another foster home when I was 16. I'd been moved from foster home to foster home since my grandmother died, so it wasn't the first time. Unfortunately, my mom struggled with drugs on a serious level. After I was born, the state took me away from her and gave me to the closest responsible relative, who happened to be my mother. I never knew my dad's identity growing up. He might have been one of my mom's numerous boyfriends, but I never knew for sure. When my grandmother died, my mother was unable to bring me back. This was primarily due to two factors. First, it was difficult for anyone to locate her, and second, she was still battling drug addiction. Although there were difficulties in every new home I moved into while in foster care, I tried my best to adjust. I was thus going from foster home to foster home within the system. This time, I ended up with a married couple in their early 50s who had raised their own children, but they had all moved out and grown up. There were roughly 7 kids living in the large, 5-bedroom house, including me. Despite their own parenting experiences, the couple was very different from previous experiences I had. They were professional and disciplined. Even though they occasionally displayed compassion, they treated the foster parenting industry as a business. From their perspective, children came and went, so they didn't become overly connected. Living with them had its challenges. The dynamic around the house was different from what I was used to. There were rules to abide by, and the house was neatly organized. They ensured that everyone completed their tasks and fulfilled their obligations, running a tight ship. It was not just a warm and loving home, but at times it felt more like living in a controlled environment. However, time passed, and I made an effort to fit into this new family dynamic by getting used to the routines and rules. Among the 7 boys in the foster home, I was the oldest at 16. The couple who hosted us had a distinctive approach to handling affairs in order to optimize their earnings. They sent us to soup kitchens and weekly pantries to get what we needed, rather than spending money on groceries. It meant they had no food expenses at all, and their only real costs were the house's mortgage and utilities. In essence, they were operating a foster home business with us and profiting handsomely from it. We had no personal relationship with the couple, who treated us more like dollar signs than like needy kids. We consequently became closer to one another. Naturally, the other kids looked up to me because I was the oldest. I assumed the role of a sort of mentor, helping them with cooking, guiding them through school, and making sure they all completed their assignments. In spite of the non-traditional setup and the couple's formal demeanor, we united as a sort of surrogate family. We didn't have a close relationship with our foster parents, but we still had support and friendship among ourselves. We kept going to the neighborhood soup kitchen, where I got to know Mrs. Carroll, fake named to protect her identity. At the age of 36, she frequently volunteered there alongside her spouse James, a pastor in the community. James, who was 42, would be joining them along with their 2 boys, ages 5 and 7. Every week, we would cross paths at the soup kitchen, and that's how I got to know Mrs. Carroll. She seemed approachable and friendly, and we would greet each other. She encouraged me to arrive early to volunteer one day while she was serving meals as usual. She clarified that they occasionally had trouble recruiting enough volunteers. I was glad to help and made a commitment to arrive early the following time. As promised, I showed up early for the subsequent volunteer opportunity. I even helped out by bringing my foster brothers with me. We were happy to help serve meals and clean up afterward, as our presence proved to be more than enough support for them. Being a part of something constructive felt good, especially in light of the difficulties we had in our foster home. My life was enhanced by Mrs. Carroll's generosity and the chance to give back to the community. Mrs. Carroll always had a warm smile on her face, and I felt that she was a really nice person. Her positive energy was very noticeable in our interactions. I didn't find out her husband James was a pastor until a day or two after we had finished serving dinner. She extended an invitation to my brothers and me to join them for a church service. I was apprehensive at the time because I had never attended church before and I had no personal connection to religion. But because Pentecostal churchgoers had consistently offered me assistance throughout my life, I had a favorable opinion of them. Even though Mrs. Carroll persisted in inviting me, I wasn't sure if I should accept her invitation. I eventually got to meet her husband James after helping out at the soup kitchen a few more times. He expressed his appreciation for my hard work in cleaning the kitchen and seemed to like me. He was impressed by my enthusiasm and amiable demeanor. But because he was constantly preoccupied with his pastoral responsibilities, it was uncommon for him to show up and offer his assistance. My misgivings about going to church were dispelled by the good experiences I had with Mrs. Carroll and James, whose generosity encouraged me to give it a shot. I made the decision to go to church one day with my two brothers who were older than I was. Instead of dressing traditionally for church, we felt a little out of place in our casual attire. With 400 to 600 members at the time, the church wasn't very large, but it was large enough that we felt like oddballs. We didn't see Mrs. Carroll during the service, we only saw her after it was over. Along with her husband, Pastor James, and a few church elders, she was seated around the pulpit. The lead singer at church was Mrs. Carroll, and she was very talented. I made sure to say hello to her after the service. Although she was pleased to see me, our conversation was brief because she quickly moved her focus to other group members. I noticed that I was thinking about Mrs. Carroll a lot over the next few weeks. I always looked forward to seeing her when we volunteered at the soup kitchen because she had been so nice to my brothers and me. I kept asking her if she needed anything because I wanted to have more conversations with her. I was drawn to her presence for some reason, and I couldn't get rid of the impression that our relationship was developing into something more than the casual hellos we would exchange at the soup kitchen. Mrs. Carroll informed me one day that her family had recently moved. She needed assistance, though, because the movers left a few things behind. She asked me to come and help because her husband, Pastor James, was too busy. I was more than happy to assist. Following the soup kitchen's closure, my brother and I got into Mrs. Carroll's car with her children and headed to her new home, which was conveniently close to the soup kitchen. We talked throughout the ride, and I told her about my upbringing as a foster child and how I never met my parents. Mrs. Carroll inquired about my future goals and offered her condolences for my predicament. I shared with her my desire to pursue a career in music. I explained that I didn't have a cell phone or internet access, so I lost contact with the friends I was learning to play an instrument with in the past. It felt oddly comforting to open up to Mrs. Carroll about my struggles and dreams. I felt a connection with her that I had never felt before because she listened intently and showed genuine concern. She surprised me by taking me to Walmart and buying me a Nokia cell phone after assisting Mrs. Carroll with the move. It was a prepaid phone with internet browsing, texting, and call capabilities. I was ecstatic. My new phone opened up a whole new world for me, and it felt like I was getting my first car. I added some friends to my contact list. But Mrs. Carroll was the one I found myself texting most of the time. This was in the pre-Instagram era, so shooting photos and sharing them with others was novel at the time. Before heading to the gym, she would send me images of her dress or her daily attire. Nothing too explicit or obscene, but I would frequently overdo it when I complimented her, telling her how adorable and gorgeous she was. She responded with new images at least twice a day, suggesting that she enjoyed it. Our exchanges became a daily routine, our little secret. Even though the photographs were not indecent, the more pictures and comments I offered her, the more my love for her intensified. It was an unexpected connection, and despite the harmless nature of our interactions, I couldn't help but feel a growing affinity between us as time went. What started as casual exchanges of daily clothing images between Mrs. Carroll and me evolved to bear special meaning. It felt like she was revealing something personal with me alone, even if it was only about her regular wardrobe. As we continued our regular communication, my affections for her deepened, especially when we met during volunteering activities at the soup kitchen. We started messaging more than talking, and after each volunteering session, she began giving me innocent hugs. While these embraces were absolutely benign, they became the highlight of my day. The lingering aroma of her perfume would stay with me, and I appreciated that small connection. I found myself continuously thinking about her and formed a crush on her. With the money I saved, I resolved to buy a jacket so I could visit her church and see her more regularly. Seeing her during the volunteering events wasn't enough anymore. One day, when she sent me a picture, I decided to communicate something I hadn't stated before. I called the picture sexy. Usually, after complimenting her, she would answer with a thank you, but this time there was nothing. I grew nervous, fearing I had screwed up. To make matters worse, she didn't send me any more images for 2 days, as if to confirm my suspicions that I had crossed the line. Feeling unhappy about my prior comment, I resolved to apologize to Mrs. Carroll in person when I saw her at the soup kitchen the next week. When we were alone and no one else could hear us, I honestly apologized for what I had said. To my relief, she acted unmoved and gave me a look as if I was overreacting. She pretended to be all right with the comment, yet her body language suggested otherwise. She wasn't as warm as she generally was with me. Strangely enough, the next day she emailed me a picture of herself. I definitely remember messaging her, "You are a goddess. I wish you were mine." Once again, she didn't say thanks but sent another image the following day. This time, her clothes were a bit tighter than normal, and it appeared improbable that she would wear such an outfit outside. I commented on how sexy she looked, and from that point on, the photographs she sent were progressively sexier. However, they still left much to the imagination, never displaying too much or without clothes. It became evident that she appreciated the attention I was giving her. Since I saw her kids every week at the soup kitchen, we grew close, and I played with them a lot. I knew them well. One day, she asked if I could babysit because she and her husband had to go somewhere. I said yes. I played hide-and-seek with her kids, and it was wonderful. When she and her husband returned, they paid me back. Then it meant a lot to me, as I didn't have a job. I utilized the money immediately away to buy clothes I really liked because the ones my foster parents got for me weren't to my taste. We got pretty close, and sometimes she'd send me playful and flirty photographs that hinted at something more without showing anything explicit. I'd react by telling her how I wished she was mine and what I wanted to do with her. She never answered with words, and we never discussed it. It was just something that happened in our text messages. One day, I babysat for her. When she went home, we played hide-and-seek with her kids. While her youngest child was supposed to discover everyone, I hid behind the closet door in the dark. Mrs. Carroll was seeking for a hiding area, and I couldn't tell if she didn't locate one or just wanted to join me. So, she decided to join me in my hiding location with her back pressed against me. We stood there as the romantic tension that had been brewing for months was hard to ignore, and I started to touch her. She turned around, and we started making out and feeling each other. We only stopped when her kids contacted us. Riding my bicycle home, I was the happiest I had ever been, absorbing the recollections. After that, she stopped sending images, and I didn't text her until she asked me to babysit again the next week. When she returned, she grabbed pizza for her kids. While they were eating, we stealthily walked to the bedroom and got personal. That was my first sexual experience. From then on, she would text me, and I would ride to her house, even when I didn't need to babysit. We would close the door and be personal. Sometimes we'd stay in bed talking. She'd implore me not to tell my friends, brothers, or anybody else about us. We built a great bond, and she explained that her husband was rigid, only wanted missionary, and was constantly busy. We were intimate at least 3 times a week. I probably should have felt bad because I was dating a married lady, and not just any married woman, but one married to a pastor. I was indifferent. I believed I was in love. I was practically captivated with her, wishing I didn't have to go home and could stay in bed with her all night talking. But I had to leave since her husband was coming home. Our time together grew less regular, approximately twice a week. Fast forward about a year later, I had found a job as a cashier, and the babysitting job wasn't as regularly or for as long. During our time together, she never requested me to use protection. Then one day, while being intimate, we neglected to shut the door and her kid walks in and sees us red-handed. I am not sure how conscious he was, but he seemed to be a smart kid. We didn't know how long he had been standing there, so we jumped and tried to protect ourselves. She hurriedly requested me to go, and I could see that she was scared. It was the first time we'd been caught, and we'd been having a relationship for about a year. From that moment on, she started growing distant. She wouldn't send me pictures or invite me over anymore. When I went to the soup kitchen to talk to her, she stated we should stop seeing each other. I couldn't get over her, so I kept contacting her and showing up to the soup kitchen. Eventually, she stopped coming, and I felt horrible, thinking it was because of me. I felt very hurt and abandoned, quietly crying for days. I stared at all the photographs she sent me like a lost dog, believing I was in love with her. After a week of not seeing her, I decided to go to her church only to catch a peek of her. This was about a month after our separation, and shockingly I found out she was pregnant. At the moment, it didn't occur to me that I might be the father. I just felt relieved, thinking that maybe she stopped seeing me because she was pregnant, not because she had abandoned me like others in my life. I went back home and focused on my career and studies. When I graduated high school, I left the foster home to join the Navy. During my time in the Navy, circa 2005, I started thinking about the prospect that I might be the father of her baby. Unfortunately, I had no method of looking them up. I determined that her spouse probably wasn't the father, as she had indicated they were not very intimate. She also informed me that I was more intimate with her than she was with her spouse. After leaving the service, I didn't think about her much since I was traveling the world and dating new women. Eventually, I married a Japanese woman and brought her to the United States. Once my business started booming, recently I looked her up on Facebook. I discovered out she's still with her husband, very involved in church issues, and their church has gotten bigger. She now has 4 kids, and when I look at the third one, I can't help but notice some features that resemble mine. However, I don't aim to upset everyone's life by exposing this knowledge. It might potentially wreck not only her life but mine as well. It feels like one of those things you take to your grave. What do you guys think I should do in this situation?